When a woman has nothing left, the world does not wait for her to recover. It keeps moving, and she either moves with it or gets buried where she stands. This is the story of Remedios Sandoval, a woman who was pushed to the very edge of everything, and who found, at that edge, something that no one had ever told her was hers. Welcome. If this story moves you, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from today. She had not seen it coming. That was the part that kept her awake at night. Long after her daughters finally stopped crying and fell asleep beside her on the thin mattress that was all she had been allowed to take. She had not seen it coming because she had trusted, and trust, she would learn, is not a shield. It is an opening. Her husband Aurelio had died on the 3rd of January, on a dry, cold morning in Veracruz, when the fog sat heavy over the milpa, and nobody could see past the second row of corn. He died quickly, a weakness of the heart that gave no warning, and he left behind Remedios, their daughters Nati and Celia, 7 and 5 years old, a small property at the edge of the ejido, and a name that meant something in that part of the state, or had meant something. Once, within a week, a man named Rodolfo Castelleda appeared. He was a notary from the city, trim and polite, with clean hands and a briefcase of brown leather that smelled like new money. He came to the house 3 times. The first time he brought condolences. The second time he brought papers. The third time he brought a buyer. He told Remedios the property had a lien against it, a debt Aurelio had signed before they married that she had never known about. He laid the document on the table and pointed to Aurelio's signature with a well-manicured finger. The debt, he said, was more than the land was worth. The buyer was offering to absorb the debt and give her a small remaining sum, enough, Castelleda said with a practiced sympathy, to get settled somewhere else. Remedios looked at the signature. She looked at the date. She looked at Castelleda's clean hands and thought of Aurelio's calloused ones, and something in her stomach went cold. But she was grieving, and she was alone, and the 2 girls were pulling at her skirt, and the document had an official seal. 3 days later she asked him directly, "What happens to us if I don't sign?" Castelleda smiled the way people smile when the answer is obvious and the question was a mistake. "The debt collectors become the ones you deal with instead of me," he said. "I'm the easier option." He picked up his briefcase and left. She stood in the doorway, watching him walk down the road until he was too small to see. 3 months later, the buyer sent men to change the locks. She had until sundown. Nathy held Celia's hand in the yard and did not say anything. 7-year-olds who have watched their mothers cry for 3 months learn to hold very still. Remedios packed what she could carry. She took the thin mattress, rolled tight, the clay pot, the rebozo her grandmother had embroidered with orange blossoms along the hem, the stitching so fine it was almost a whisper in thread. She left the furniture. She left the curtains she had sewn herself. She walked out of the gate with 1 daughter on each side, a bundle on her back, and the flat, quiet face of someone who has used up all the expressions that don't cost anything and is saving the ones that do. The road out of the ejido was 12 kilometers of packed dirt. Remedios walked it in 4 hours, the girls taking turns at the bundle when she needed her arms free. The sky over the Gulf was the color of old pewter, and the sea wind came in warm and damp from the east, smelling of salt and something sweet she could never name, copal, maybe, or the sugar-cane fields 3 hills over. She stopped once to let the girls rest under a ceiba tree. Natty said she was thirsty. Remedios gave her the last of the water. Celia had fallen asleep against the tree trunk, with her mouth open, one hand flat on the earth, the way small children sleep when they have surrendered completely to exhaustion. She looked so small, Everything about her looked so small and so trusting at the same time, unaware that the world had already decided to be difficult, not yet old enough to brace for it. Remedios sat beside them and allowed herself 3 minutes. She counted them. She had learned to ration rest the way she had learned to ration water, not by feeling, but by counting. When the 3 minutes were done, she stood up, shifted the bundle, and put her hand on Natty's shoulder. Time to walk. Natty stood up without complaining. She woke Celia without being asked. That was the thing about her older daughter that sometimes made Remedios's chest ache. She had already learned at 7 how to be useful when it was needed and silent when it was not. What Remedios did not know yet was that the road was taking her exactly where she was meant to go. The town of San Andres Tenexla sat where the foothills met the coastal plain, a town of white walls and orange tile roofs, and a central square with a laurel tree so old its roots had buckled the stone pavement in 3 places. She reached it at dusk, when the street lamps were just coming on, and the smell of someone's supper, black beans, warm tortillas, a hint of epazote, drifted from behind a wall and made her stomach tighten with a hunger she hadn't let herself feel all day. She found the parish and sat on the steps with the girls on either side of her. After a while, the sacristan came out, a thin, older man who moved like someone who had learned not to make noise. He looked at the 3 of them without surprise, the way people look at things they have seen before. He went back inside. 10 minutes later, he came back with a cup of atole and 3 tin cups, and he poured without asking anything. His name was Don Parciello. He was 64 years old, a widower, with the slow, deliberate speech of a man who had spent decades choosing words carefully because he knew the wrong ones couldn't be taken back. He asked only what he needed to ask. She told him only what he needed to know. He listened with his hands resting open on his knees, the way people sit when they intend to be patient. Then he told her about the mill. It was at the east end of the town, past the last row of houses, where the road became a track, and the track became a footpath going into the hillside. Nobody had used it for 20 years. The family it had belonged to, the Alcantara family, had left for the capital one by one over the years, and the last of them, a woman named Doa Gracia, had died 8 years ago without leaving clear instructions about what should happen to it. The property was technically in dispute among distant relatives who had never agreed on anything, so it simply sat, a stone building with a covered patio, a grinding room that still had the old millstone, and in the back, a bread oven that the Alcantara women had used for 3 generations. It has walls, Don Parciello said. And it has a roof. And nobody is sleeping in it. He said it with no particular warmth, the way a practical man states a practical fact. But then he looked at the 2 girls, who had both fallen asleep leaning against their mother, and he said something else. Doa Gracia would not have wanted it empty. That night they slept under a roof for the first time in weeks. The mill smelled of old stone and dry wood, and something faintly sweet that Remedios couldn't place at first. She figured it out in the morning, when the light came through the eastern window and fell on the oven in the back room. It was the smell of bread. Not fresh bread, not bread baking, but the memory of bread. The smell that soaks into stone and mortar after years and years of loaves going in and out. The smell that a well-used oven never fully loses. She stood in front of it for a long time. The arch was intact. The interior was dark and cold and perfectly dry. Natty came and stood beside her. "Ma'am," she said, "do you know how to use that?" Remedios put her hand against the stone above the arch. It was cool and rough and absolutely solid. "My grandmother taught me," she said. Don Parciello came that morning with bread and coffee and a block of piloncillo wrapped in banana leaf, and he came every morning for the next week. He came alone the first few days, and then the third day he brought with him a man named Victoriano Herrera, Don Victorio to everyone in town, who was 71 years old and had spent 50 of those years as a mason, and who looked at the oven with the professional respect of someone who knows good construction when he sees it. 3 generations built this, Don Victorio said, crouching to look at the base of the arch. The Alcantara women knew what they were doing. He came back the next day with mortar and a trowel, because 2 of the hearthstones needed reseating. He did not ask if he could. He simply came and did it, the way useful people do things. Remedios watched him work and then worked beside him, and by the end of the afternoon the 2 of them had cleaned the ash chamber and reset the stones, and Don Victorio had shown her how to build the fire in the right sequence. Small wood first, then the larger pieces. Let it breathe from the bottom. That evening, she lit the oven for the first time. The girls watched the fire take hold with the absolute attention of children watching something they understand is important. Nati held Celia's hand. The orange light moved on their faces. Remedios sat back on her heels and felt something she hadn't felt in months. Not happiness exactly, but the solid feeling underneath happiness. The feeling that the ground exists and will hold. The daily rhythm built itself quietly, the way real things do. She woke before light. She started the fire. She made coffee in the clay pot while the oven heated, 35 minutes to full temperature. Don Victorio had told her, and she learned to read the color of the smoke and the heat coming from the arch as naturally as reading weather. The girls slept until the smell woke them, and then they came to the back room in their nightgowns and sat on the stone bench while she worked. Nati began helping with the shaping. Her hands were small, but her instinct for pressure was right, and she understood without being told that dough responds to patience, not to force. Celia swept the patio with a broom cut to her size, and then arranged the firewood pieces by size the way she had watched Don Victorio do it. Smallest to largest, precise and unnecessary and completely her own. Don Victorio arrived at mid-morning with whatever he had managed to source. Flour from the cooperative, eggs from his neighbor's hens, lard, salt, once a whole bag of vanilla beans wrapped in a cloth because someone at the market owed him a favor. He sat on the patio and drank his coffee and told stories about the Alcantara family, about what the mill had been in its working years, about Doa Gracia and her mother and her grandmother before her. 3 women who had fed this part of the town for decades. He never told these stories as lessons. He told them the way old people tell stories about places they love, because the telling keeps something alive that would otherwise go quiet. Doa Gracia always said this oven had a good soul, he said one morning. What does that mean? Nati asked. Don Victorio thought about it. It means the bread comes out better here than it would anywhere else. Nati considered this seriously and went back to shaping her small roll. It was Don Victorio who found the box. He had been repairing a section of the back wall where the plaster had cracked and come loose, working methodically with his trowel, when the blade caught on something behind the plaster that gave a hollow sound. He stopped. He worked more carefully. Behind a section of old mortar, set into a niche in the stone wall that had been plastered over so completely it was invisible unless you knew to look, was a small cedar box, sealed with a latch of tarnished brass. He called Remedios without raising his voice. She came from the oven room, drying her hands on her apron. He showed her the niche, the box, the latch. He did not touch it again. He stood back and let her reach for it herself, because he understood, without anyone telling him, that what was in that box was not his to open. In the cedar box, wrapped in a cloth that had once been white, there was a folded document and a letter. Remedios sat down on the stone bench with the box in her lap. Don Victorio stood nearby. The girls had stopped what they were doing and come to the doorway without being told. The letter was from Doa Gracia Alcantara. It was dated 6 years before her death. The handwriting was careful and deliberate, the handwriting of someone who wanted to be understood precisely, and it said that the mill and the bread oven and the surrounding land had been in the Alcantara family for 112 years, that they had never been sold, that a man named Rodolfo Castaeda had presented documents to a court in the city claiming to have purchased the property from the family's heirs, and that those documents were forged, that the real deed was enclosed, certified by the original notary in 1910 and renewed in 1978, and that she, Gracia Alcantara, was placing this letter and this deed in the wall of the oven room because she trusted the oven, and everything placed in the care of this oven had always been kept safe. In the cedar box on top of the letter was a notarized deed to the property, clean, sealed, legitimate, and bearing the name of the Alcantara family, with a handwritten addendum in Doa Gracia's writing that said, "To whoever keeps this oven burning, this place belongs." Remedios read it once. Then she read it again. She looked at Don Victorio. "Castaeda," she said. Don Victorio's expression did not change, but something behind his eyes went very still. "What about him?" "He was the notary who made me sign over Aurelio's land. He said there was a lien. He brought a buyer." She stopped. She looked at the deed in her hands. "He's been doing this." Don Victorio was quiet for a moment. Then he said, in the voice of a man who has lived long enough to not be surprised by the worst things people do, "There is a lawyer in Salapa who handles exactly this kind of case. I know him personally. He is honest, which in his profession is worth mentioning." The children had not moved from the doorway. Celia said, "Ma'am, is the box magic?" Remedios looked at her youngest, 5 years old, still in her dusty dress from yesterday, holding the small broom in both hands. "No," said Remedios. "It's better than magic. It's proof." Castaeda arrived on a Thursday afternoon, with 2 men she didn't recognize and a new document. "This one," he said, correcting a procedural error in the original title transfer, and she simply needed to sign here and here to complete the process. He was as smooth as the first time she had ever seen him, briefcase in hand, polished shoes somehow clean after the dirt road from town. That same expression of practiced sympathy that she now understood was not sympathy at all, but its very precise opposite. The face of someone who has learned to seem kind while doing the cruelest thing the law allows. He came through the patio gate without knocking. That detail Remedios would remember for years, not the briefcase, not the document, not even his face. The fact that he walked through her gate without knocking. It said everything about what he thought she was. She was standing at the oven when they came through. Nati and Celia were in the kitchen. She did not call them out, and she did not step back from the oven. "I'm not signing anything," she said. Castaeda looked at her with the patient expression of a man who has managed difficult situations before. "Señora Sandoval, I understand you're in a complicated position, but this document simply—" "The mill belongs to the Alcantara estate," Remedios said. "I have the original deed. I have Doa Gracia's letter. And I have a lawyer in Salapa who has already sent copies to the State Registry Office and the Attorney General's office in the city." Castaeda went very still. "The deed you presented to the court was forged," Remedios said. "So was the lien on my husband's property. Both carry your signature and your official stamp. My lawyer says that's a criminal matter, not a civil one." One of the men behind Castaeda took a small step backward toward the gate. Don Victorio was sitting on the patio bench, which he had been doing when they arrived, his coffee cup in his hands. He hadn't stood up. He hadn't said a word. He simply sat there, 71 years old and entirely composed, and his presence in that space communicated something that Castañeda, for all his briefcase and his clean hands, finally understood. "You have no idea what you're involving yourself in," Castañeda said, but his voice had lost its smoothness. Remedios looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned back to the oven. "You should leave," she said. "The bread needs to come out." He left. The two men went with him. Don Victorio refilled his coffee cup from the pot on the patio table and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. By the time the mango trees flowered and the Gulf winds turned warm and steady, the bread from the mill oven had become something people in San Andres Tinexla planned their mornings around. Remedios baked 6 days a week, starting before dawn, and by 8 in the morning there was a line of women at the patio gate, some for bread, some for the rolls Nati had started making, with a slight adjustment to the dough she'd figured out herself and refused to explain entirely, some just to stand in the smell of it for a moment before the day began. The way people seek out warmth without quite knowing that is what they are seeking. The patio smelled of wood smoke and vanilla and warm flour, and the orange blossom from the naranjo that Don Victorio had planted along the east wall, which had bloomed 3 months after it went in the ground, as if it too had been waiting for the right moment. The legal case moved slowly, the way legal cases do. Castañeda had lawyers of his own, but the deed was real, and the forgery was documented, and Doa Gracia's letter was entered into evidence, and every month the lawyer in Salapa sent Remedios a letter with an update, and the same closing line, "We are making progress." Aurelio's land was a separate matter, more complicated, but also moving. Don Victorio came every morning. He had built a wooden shelf for the bread, and a second bench in the patio, and a gate latch that actually worked. One afternoon he showed Nati how to use a trowel, demonstrating the angle on a small patch of wall that needed replastering, and Nati spent 40 minutes on it with the focus of a child who has recognized a skill she wants to own. Celia sat nearby drawing in the dirt with a stick, narrating her drawing to herself in a low voice. One morning, Remedios found tucked in the back cover of the old recipe book that had been left in the mill's kitchen, a book she used daily for Doa Gracia's bread recipes, written out in the same careful handwriting as the letter, a slip of paper she hadn't noticed before. It said in Doa Gracia's hand, "The oven keeps the secret until the right person comes to need it. I always knew someone would come." Remedios read it standing at the shelf, flour on her hands, the oven already burning behind her. Don Victorio came through the gate at his usual hour with the flour sack over his shoulder and found her standing there. "Everything all right?" he asked. She turned around. She knew, Remedios said. Doa Gracia. She knew someone would come. Don Victorio set down the flour. He looked at the oven, at the girls in the patio, at the line of women already forming at the gate. "Of course she knew," he said simply. "She built it to last. Sometimes the most desperate moments are not the end of something. They are the locked door behind which everything that was always yours is waiting." Remedios did not arrive at the mill oven by luck. She arrived by having no other direction to walk. And the oven was there. And the cedar box was there. And Don Victorio was there. Because there are people who exist for exactly this, to catch the ones who are falling and quietly hand back what was taken. Have you ever had to let go of something you loved in order to receive what you truly needed? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment and tell us where in the world you're watching from. Give it a like if you believe that what is truly ours cannot be permanently taken. Subscribe to Stories Between Lives and turn on the bell so you don't miss a single story. Share this with someone who needs to be reminded that the worst day can be the day you find the door. Until the next story, with all our heart. And remember, what is built to last, lasts.